So I was thinking it might be neat to go into like a little bit of the mythology of the Severus album. Now, so like me and the band play a lot of the Severus songs live, but there's no recordings of it yet. And it has this whole sort of mythology that I made for it, revolving around the narrator character who I called Enki. And Enki's sort of a name that I borrowed from Sumerian mythology. And one of the neat things about that character is that he, I guess, has this other name called Ea, and of course it's just the letters E and A, and then Ea is the logo for elitefitrea. It's the first and the last letter, and it's sort of like this, this yin-yang kind of symbol. And it kind of fit with the mythology so well that it just kind of made me excited when I noticed that, because I chose the name Enki before I found out that Enki had this other name of Ea. So anyway, in the Sumerian, Enki has this brother, I think his name is Enlil, and the names aren't as important to me as the sort of story. So the backstory is something that I kind of borrowed from the Melchizedek books. And I read those in prison. It's the Flower of Life books that guy Melchizedek wrote. And I'm not taking that stuff, seriously, but as far as like creating a sort of interesting take on the fall story, I thought it was kind of cool. So I'm not talking about any existing philosophy or religious story. I'm just borrowing things and creating my own collage that creates its own story. So in the Severus backstory, there's this sort of idea that it's called the splitting sun. So the splitting sun is like the original consciousness that created everything. So it's basically the idea of God before reality existed, and then the idea that God continued splitting into like halves, and then each of these halves became smaller and smaller and smaller, and at the very tiny, and then several thousand divisions down the road, these are like human souls or like pieces of reality and stuff like that. The idea is that the splitting sun, before it split, imagined everything that could be imagined and did everything that could be done until it realized the only thing it had left to do was to die, basically. And so in dying, it split itself into two different entities, each of whom were almost identical. Similar to how a hologram, if you split a hologram in half, you get two, equal size. You get two whole holograms that are half the size. One was Enki and the other was Enlil in this story. And then Enki and Enlil were sort of like the first, you could say brothers, but they didn't have sexes. So, because they were like spiritual beings. So imagining them as like being the first friends, the first lovers, the first like anything that two creatures could do or discover. I mean, who knows what the eternity would, you're supposed to kind of just imagine it. And then the main difference between Enlil and Enki is Enlil had the part of him that was not afraid of death. So Enlil was like willing to continue to subdivide, and then Enki was not. And so Enki kind of represents samsara in a sense, the attachment and all of the things that flow from attachment. And so that's why he's kind of like the devil character. So he's the god of attachment, the god of samsara, the god of kind of like suffering for the things that you want versus letting things go and knowing that nothing is permanent. Now, so I thought that was kind of an interesting psychological, place for Enki. And so Enki feels kind of betrayed by Enlil's decision to continue to subdivide, and sets out to sort of torture, trick, and betray the descendants of Enlil. And that's kind of why he kind of fulfills the devil role in that capacity. So you could say that the descendants of Enlil, if you were to take this mythology as a story that includes humanity, you would say humanity are the descendants of Enlil, and Enki is like the torturer of humanity because he hates Enlil for deserting him. Now, he would also have a sort of it's sort of like a jilted lover too. He's got like this, he misses Enlil, and the reason he hates Enlil is because he didn't want Enlil to dissolve. So it's not that he hates him per se, it's just that he can't get over the fact that Enlil chose to die. And so there's this whole like love-hate thing brewing inside of Enki. Now, occasionally Enki is able to trick a descendant of Enlil into basically joining his side. So there are various descendants of Enlil, along the subdivisions that also decided not to continue to subdivide. And there's kind of an echo of Enki and the devil character. So there's this idea in, at least, I don't know if it's in Judaism or Islam, but there's this idea, at least that I grew up with in Christianity, where the devil was like the angel that was the closest to God, or like the brightest of the angels. And since Enki is the first subdivision, he's the closest to God there's ever been, and also the oldest soul with the longest living memory. So out of all of the descendants of the splitting sun, Enki is the closest to God, and that's that gives him a lot of power and a lot of influence. But of course he's not God. He's like God -1 or something like that, like infinity -1 instead of infinity. And so anyway, in the Severus sort of storyline, I think that there are multiple Severus events in this chronology, but this is a certain one. And I kind of imagine Enki, down the road as maybe coming to grips with the dissolution kind of idea, but rather than subdividing, he just pinches off little pieces of himself, and those become sort of little devils. Because as you continue to subdivide, the souls get really tiny. And so he just has to pinch the tiniest part of himself off to create something that's equivalent or even greater to the equivalent of a human soul. And then he also has enlisted a lot of the sons or the descendants of Enlil in his entourage as well. And anyway, you could say that they're outcasts, but on Mount Olympus or whatever, in the realm of the gods, it's not like they're outcast from that realm. They still live there and they still interact. But there's just a sort of schism. And anyway, at some point in this chronology, there is I would say that even though he's the god of samsara, he still retains a lot of, he's not evil, he's just the god of attachment. And he is a complicated character. He's very human in his attachments. And for the Severus album, so this is all kind of a backstory to the Severus album. And I don't explain any of that in Severus, because one of my flaws, I think, is that I prefer to just show and not tell, I prefer to just go. One thing my wife is always saying is, this doesn't say anything. And I'm like, it says a lot. You just have to, you have to think about it and make it up on your own. You have to fill in the gaps on your own. So I do that too much probably, but it just is kind of more fun to me to just leave a lot unsaid, even though I've articulated to myself a lot of the stuff in the spaces or the gaps or whatever. So anyway, in the Severus story, basically there's this sort of heaven, Mount Olympus, or this idea where they all live in this certain place, and all the they're sort of incorporeal. They don't have bodies. They sort of don't affect the material realm. But the very tiniest of the descendants of Enlil have become material. So there's some process of becoming material that maybe when you get small enough or you become distant enough from the source, you become material. Or maybe there are souls who decide to become material, and then in becoming material they necessarily forget that they were immaterial before. You could say that. There's a lot of stuff about simulations and dreams, and there's the whole life as a video game sort of thing, or life as a immersive experience, that kind of how that overlaps with reincarnation and stuff like that. So that's not necessarily in the Severus story though, but basically Mount Olympus kind of maps to our society in the sense that it's a technological feat and masterpiece, and it requires sustained effort to keep going. And a lot of the residents of this sort of heaven or Mount Olympus or Valhalla or whatever, just as an aside, isn't it interesting that in history people have this conception that Valhalla was, when I first heard about Valhalla, I was like, what kind of fucking heaven is that, where you're eternally fighting and what, so during the day you fight all day, then you feast, and then you sleep, and then you do it again. And that's exactly what video games are, isn't it? It's because I had a lot of cellmates in the halfway house that they had earned video game privileges, and they would just play these war video games all fucking every bit of free time they had, and I was like, oh shit, this is Valhalla. Cheetos and fucking Call of Duty. But anyway, so there's kind of I guess maybe, I haven't read Ayn Rand, but there's sort of a fountainhead aspect where the people that built and maintained this Valhalla sphere, or this heavenly sphere, sort of didn't like where it was going. It felt like the people that were benefiting from it, the souls that were not putting the work in, were taking heaven in a direction that they didn't like. And then they started deciding, well, we're not going to continue to keep it going anymore. And it kind of maps onto a lot of stuff. It maps onto the left and the right. It maps onto the disempowered. It maps onto the battle of the sexes, women and men who decide they're not getting a fair deal, so they want to sort of cut themselves off from. It's basically any countercultural sort of story is kind of echoed here. So they decide we're not doing it anymore, and they decide they're going to join Enki in becoming material beings. So they're basically insisting, they're encapsulating themselves off from this spiritual realm, and they're becoming material beings. And there's kind of this new age idea that a long time ago human beings did this, and we've been in the material realm for so long we forgot. There's a lot of mythology in Severus that maps onto all sorts of stuff that I've read. And part of them becoming material creatures is, they're becoming, they take on these forms that are hideous to, hideous to the, what you might call the angels or whatever. And it kind of it reminds me of like the meme wars in a sense, you know, creating this imagery that is like utterly repulsive and repugnant to the, you know, the purveyors of social etiquette and everything, you know, the grotesque Pepes, and you know, it's all very, it's the same process. It's becoming demonic and repugnant to the people who have power, the heavenly beings, you know. And I mean, I was writing Severus as that stuff was going on, and I was like, wow, this is like the same fucking story. And anyway, it's basically the album Severus is basically told through various speeches that Enki delivers to basically all these various descendants of Enlil, as well as pieces of himself that he cut away as little souls, little demon souls or whatever. And they're sort of building this technological paradise. They have the ability to create virtual realities. You know, there's sort of this idea, especially in Black Mirror, in that series, where technology gets to a point that you're creating these virtual realities, and that's almost the same process. Like if you could create a society that's beyond scarcity, like a post-scarcity society, and then you start creating virtual worlds, and then you get people that live in those virtual worlds, and then you get to where the virtual world is the real world. And that's kind of like, you know, the Matrix movies and stuff, only without the robot slavery and stuff. It's kind of about that, you know. Imagine a counter-revolutionary movement that says, we're not going to live in the real world anymore. We're going to live in the false world, and it's going to be our world, and it's going to be, who knows what it would be. Like maybe it would just be full of anime porn, or, you know, who knows. But that's kind of the idea, and it's, I saw it kind of as a cycle, like where Enki is this character that kind of does this every cycle, you know, however long a cycle is, you know. I don't know that there's an answer to how long a cycle is, but I don't know, it maps onto a lot of real things in society and in mythology. And as I was working on it, it was just fucking really cool to discover all of that. And so I thought I'd share it a little bit. And this shit probably doesn't make any fucking sense at all to anybody, but it made a lot of sense to me while I was working on it. And of course, Severus isn't a release yet, so I think I'll probably start working on recording Severus next year. I mean, I have a lot of it written, a lot of it's not written. It'll probably be, it's definitely more grand in its scope than Lethe was, or is, depending on when you see this, but I don't know. It's just cool to be able to work on this stuff. Alright, that's all.